The deed was under the bird feeder seed the whole time. The first thing I want you to understand about me is that on the morning everything was still fine, I was on my knees in the gravel driveway of a rented duplex in Rochester, New Hampshire, coaxing a 19-year-old beagle named Ducket to eat scrambled egg off a spatula. Ducket belonged to a widower 2 doors down who could no longer drive, and I had gotten into the habit of stopping by before my shift because a dog that old deserves a warm breakfast and a person who talks to him in complete sentences. The egg smelled like the cheap margarine I bought in a tub. The frost on the chain link was going soft in the sun, and Ducket got a full third of it down before he decided he was finished, which for him counted as a triumph. I remember thinking, as I scraped the spatula clean and told the old man his dog was a champion, that I had built a life so small and so exactly mine that no one could really get at it. I was 51 years old. I had $31 in my checking account until Friday, and I was, in that specific gravel and egg moment, about as content as a person gets. I have been a veterinary technician for 26 years, most of them at the same clinic on Wakefield Street, a low brick building that used to be a dentist's office and still has the reinforced ceiling anchor where a dental chair once bolted down. I am the person who holds the cat that everyone else has given up on, who finds the vein in the dehydrated ferret, who reads the room and knows before the doctor does that the family in exam 3 has already decided and just needs permission. People think the hard part of my job is the blood, and the blood is nothing. The hard part is that I am usually the last calm voice a frightened animal hears, and I have learned to keep my own hands steady while everything inside me goes to water, because the alternative helps no one. That skill, the trick of separating what my face does from what my chest does, is the closest thing I have to a superpower. And I want to be clear that I did not know, at the egg and Ducket stage of things, that I would ever need it for anything but the animals. I was single by choice, and I mean that the way you mean it when you have been asked 300 times and have stopped softening the answer. I had been married once to Zane's father, a man named Cormac Bly, who sold industrial flooring and left when Zane was 6. And I raised the boy alone in a series of increasingly small apartments while I finished my certification at night. I want to be honest that I loved being his mother more than I have ever loved anything, and that I told myself for years the smallness of our life was a season and not a shape. I kept a jar on the windowsill, an old wide-mouth ball jar that had held my grandmother's rendered lard, and then held my spare change, and then, for a long stretch, held the folded receipts from every field trip and dental cleaning and pair of cleats I paid for, one at a time. I am telling you about the jar now because it matters later, and because I am not the kind of narrator who hides things from you and springs them at the end. Here is the part I never said out loud, not to Zane, not to anyone at the clinic, not even really to myself in a way that felt true. My mother's family, the Halcyons, had money. Real money. The old New England kind that comes from a mill, and then from selling the mill, and then from a control systems company that took the family name, Halcyon Systems, and turned it into circuit boards for hospital equipment. My mother married down, on purpose and with great satisfaction, and she raised me in a triple-decker in Manchester and told me that the money was a leash, and that the smartest thing she ever did was refuse to hold the other end. I inherited a trust when she died, the year I turned 40, and I did with it exactly what she would have wanted, which is to say, almost nothing. I paid off the small debts. I did not quit my job. I let it sit in an account managed by a firm in Portsmouth, and I did not touch the principal, because touching it felt like picking up the leash, and I had spent my whole childhood watching what the leash did to people. I mention it here, plainly, at the 18% mark of my own story, because I refuse to dangle it over you for 40 minutes. The money existed, I never wore it. That is the whole trick, and it is not a trick at all. The first wrong note came at Thanksgiving, and it was so small that I spent a week arguing myself out of it. Zane was 31 by then, married 2 years to a woman named Diane who did something in medical device sales that she described as relationship management. And they had driven up from Nashua in a leased Audi that Zane parked at an angle across 2 spaces in my landlord's lot, as though the lines were a suggestion for other people. Over the turkey, which I had brined for 2 days in a cooler on the back step because my oven runs hot and my counters run short, Zane asked me a question that a son does not usually ask his mother across a folding table. He asked me, lightly, laughing, refilling Diane's wine, whether I had ever thought about getting my affairs in order, because Marla down the street had died without a will, and it had been an absolute nightmare for the kids. I said I had a will, which was true, a plain one I'd had drawn up years back that left everything to him because there was no one else. He nodded, and Diane nodded, and there was a beat, a half-second of held breath in which the two of them looked at each other in a way that I catalogued and then deliberately uncatalogued, the way you talk yourself out of the shape you saw in the dark hallway. I told myself he was being responsible. I told myself Diane had lost a grandmother to probate court, and it had frightened her. I passed the sweet potatoes, which I make with a splash of the maple syrup I trade a coworker for in exchange for boarding her rabbit, and I let it go. That is the thing about the first wrong note. It is always in tune enough to hum along with. The erosion, when it came the way water gets into a foundation, which is to say, from below and without drama. In January, Diane started calling me on Sunday afternoons, warm as a heat lamp, asking about my health in a way that felt less like concern and more like inventory. She wanted to know about my blood pressure, my cholesterol, whether the clinic offered a retirement plan, whether I had ever considered that, at my age, the stairs in the duplex might become a problem. I answered every question because I am polite and because I did not yet have a name for what she was doing, and I noticed that she never once asked about Duckett or the clinic or the barn cat with the abscess I'd been draining all week, which is to say, she never once asked about my actual life. She asked only about the parts of me that could be tallied. In February, Zane called to tell me he'd found me a financial advisor, a man named Grady from Diane's church, who could consolidate everything and make it simple. I told him my affairs were already simple, $31 worth of simple most weeks, and he laughed too hard and said, "Mom, come on, you can't be that tapped out. You're a halcyon." And there it was, the word I never used, sitting in my son's mouth like he had found it in my coat pocket. I asked him where he'd heard that name, and he said Diane had done some research on the family, which is a thing a person says when they have been looking at you the way a contractor looks at a lot. I got off the phone and stood in my kitchen for a while, listening to the radiator tick, and I understood, in the calm, clinical way I understand that a cat is dying before the owner does, that my son had married a woman who had priced me. In March, they came up just to visit, and Diane asked to use my bathroom and was gone for 11 minutes. And when I went down the short hall to the little second bedroom I use for storage, the closet door was open a hand's width, and the file box where I keep my documents had been moved 4 inches from the dryer, its lid not quite reseated. Nothing was missing. I checked twice, that night and again in the morning. But I am a person who notices when a spatula is in the wrong drawer, and I knew the box had been opened, and I knew that whatever she was looking for, she had either found or confirmed did not live there. I did not confront her. I want you to sit with that because it is the part people find hardest to believe. I did not confront her because I had spent 30 years learning that the calmest hands win, and because a part of me, the part raised by a woman who refused the leash, wanted to see exactly how far they would go. They went all the way in April, and the only reason they got the room to do it was that in April I nearly died. It was a diverticular bleed, which is a undignified thing to almost die of, and it put me in Frisbee Memorial for 9 days, 4 of them in a fog of transfusions and a morphine drip that made the ceiling tiles breathe. I want to describe those 9 days honestly, because the genre would have me be lucid and secretly plotting, and I was neither. I was a 51-year-old woman with a tube in her arm, frightened, weak enough that a nurse named Pilar had to help me to the bathroom, and grateful past speech every time Vanessa showed up. Vanessa Okafor had been my friend for 19 years, ever since she brought in a Newfoundland with bloat at 10 at night, and I stayed 3 hours past close to save it. She is a probate and estate attorney now, with a 2-desk practice above the credit union in Dover. And she came to the hospital every single day, once with a Tupperware of Jollof rice because, she said, the transfusion could give me blood, but only rice could give me back my spirit. Zane came once, on day 2, for 40 minutes, with Diane, who cried prettily and held my hand and asked the day nurse, in the hallway, in a voice she thought I couldn't hear, whether the doctors had said anything about long-term prognosis. Here is what they did while I was breathing through a tube. Diane knew, because I am an honest fool and had answered all her Sunday questions, that my old will was a simple one, drawn up by a since-retired lawyer in Somersworth, and that I kept no copy with any active attorney. So she had a new one drafted, on my behalf, dated the 2nd week of my hospital stay, and she had it witnessed and notarized by 2 people from her church and a notary who, it would later turn out, was Grady the financial advisor's brother-in-law. The new will left everything to Zane, which the old one already did, so on its face it changed nothing and would raise no alarm. But it did 2 things the old one didn't. It named Diane as co-executor and successor beneficiary, so that if Zane predeceased me, the entire estate flowed to her and not to any child they might have. And it revoked all prior wills and codicils, and, in a clause tucked into the 3rd page, granted Zane a durable power of attorney over my finances, effective upon 2 physicians' certification of incapacity, with Grady's brother-in-law standing ready to be one of the physician's notary and Diane's cousin, a nurse practitioner, positioned to be a certifier. It was, Vanessa told me later, a genuinely competent piece of forgery, which is the most chilling compliment I have ever heard her pay anyone. They forged my signature. That is the plain fact at the center of all of it. My daughter-in-law sat at a kitchen table in Nashua while I lay bleeding in Dover, and she practiced my signature off the back of a birthday check I had sent them. And then she signed my name to a document that would have let my son take control of my money and my care the moment 2 paid-off men agreed I couldn't think straight. I found out about it because the notary, Grady's brother-in-law, had an attack of either conscience or cowardice about 6 weeks after I came home, and mailed a copy anonymously to the only estate attorney in the county whose name he'd have known, which was Vanessa, because her billboard is on Route 108 and it has her face on it. He mailed it to the wrong side, or the right side, depending on where you're standing. Vanessa drove to my duplex on a Tuesday evening in late May with the copy in a manila folder and a bottle of the ginger beer I like. And she sat me down at my folding table and put the document in front of me and watched my face while I read it. I read all 3 pages twice. And I want to tell you what I felt because the honest answer surprised even me. I did not feel rage, at least not the hot kind. I felt the exact thing I feel when a family that loves its dog has decided, out of love, to let it suffer 3 weeks too long, and I have to be the one to say the true thing gently. I felt a cold, level clarity settle over me, the clarity of a person who has finally stopped being asked to interpret the shape in the dark hallway because someone has switched on the light. My son had let his wife forge my death paperwork while I was too weak to hold a spoon. There was no unseeing that, and, God help me, there was no grief left in me for the version of him I'd been protecting. I had run out. It was almost restful. I did not weep over the manila folder, and I did not reach for my phone to call him and let my voice climb, and I did not do the thing the frightened, egg-scraping version of me might have done a decade earlier, which was to find a way to blame myself for having raised him. What I did was ask Vanessa a single practical question. I asked her what the trust actually was. Because here is the part they got wrong, the priced me part, the research Diane had done off the internet. They knew the name Halcyon. They knew there was money somewhere in my mother's line. The one thing their internet research had never surfaced, because I had never told a living soul except Vanessa, was the structure of it. The Portsmouth firm did not hold a pile of cash with my name on a will. It held a revocable living trust, established by my mother and resettled in my name the year she died, of which I was both the grantor and the sole trustee. Everything of any value that I owned, the trust principal that had quietly grown to a little over $2 million, the 17-acre parcel of my grandmother's land in Barrington that I had never mentioned because I let a neighbor hay it and took nothing for it, all of it lived inside that trust. A will only governs what a person owns at death that isn't already spoken for by something else, and a revocable trust, which I could amend or drain or dissolve with a signature any afternoon I liked, spoke for nearly everything I had. The forged will they'd built their whole quiet plan around governed my folding table, my 19-year-old car, and the $31 in my checking account until Friday. They had forged a signature to steal a folding table. They just didn't know that yet. I told Vanessa I did not want to press charges, and she argued with me for 20 minutes about the forgery being a felony. And she was right, and I still said no, not out of mercy, or not only. I said no because a criminal case would take 2 years and would put me on a witness stand describing my own son's cruelty to a jury of strangers in Strafford County, and because winning it would mean nothing to me but a headline and a debt to the state. I did not want him punished. I want to be precise about this because it is the whole spine of what I am telling you. I did not want him ruined, and I did not want him in a cage, and I did not lie awake picturing his face when it fell. I wanted, with a want so simple it barely had words, to be free of him. I wanted to be a person who was not being appraised. That was all. That was everything. So we did it the boring, legal, unglamorous way, over the course of 9 days in June, which is the only kind of victory I have ever trusted. Vanessa amended the trust. As sole trustee and grantor, I signed, in front of Vanessa and a notary who was nobody's brother-in-law, a full restatement that removed Zane as a beneficiary of the trust entirely, named a small animal rescue in Farmington and Vanessa's own daughter's college fund as remainder beneficiaries, and appointed Vanessa as successor trustee should I ever become unable to serve. Then I executed a new, valid will, one that explicitly revoked all prior instruments purporting to be my will, including, without limitation, any instrument dated during the month of April of this year, language Vanessa chose with visible pleasure. Then, because the forged will contained that durable power of attorney, I signed a formal revocation of any and all powers of attorney, and Vanessa sent certified copies of that revocation to my bank, to the Portsmouth firm, to Frisbee Memorial's records department, and, by certified mail with return receipt, to Zane and Diane at the house in Nashua. That last one was not strictly necessary. Vanessa said it was, for notice. I let her say that. And I moved the deed. The one physical thing I owned that mattered, the deed to the 17 acres in Barrington, my grandmother's land, had been living for 11 years in the ball jar on my windowsill, folded into eighths beneath a 2-inch layer of black oil sunflower seed that I keep there to refill the feeder on the back rail. It had been under the birdseed the entire time Diane was pricing me, the entire 9 days I was bleeding, the whole afternoon she spent 11 minutes in my bathroom, and 4 inches into my file box. She had gone through the box in the storage room like a professional, and the single most valuable document I owned had been sitting in a lard jar in plain sight on the kitchen windowsill the whole time. Because it never once occurred to her that a woman who scrapes egg off a spatula for someone else's dog might be sitting on 17 acres of unencumbered New Hampshire land. I took the deed to Vanessa. We recorded a transfer into the trust at the registry in Dover, and it cost me $42, and I paid it in cash. And I have never, in my life, spent $42 I enjoyed more. Zane called 11 days later. He had received the certified letter, and he had, I could tell within 4 words, spoken to a lawyer of his own, some Nashua strip mall estate man Diane's church had produced, who had explained to them what a revocable trust is. He did not know that I knew about the forgery. He thought the letter was just me, spiteful and confused, cutting him out of a will over some slight he couldn't name. He was at first, in the voice he uses, the reasonable one, the one that manages relationships. He said we should sit down like adults. He said Diane was hurt that I'd send lawyers' letters over a misunderstanding. He said, and I wrote this one down, "Mom, you're not thinking clearly, and honestly, that worries me. That's exactly what we've been worried about." That's exactly what we've been worried about. The certification of incapacity clause, spoken aloud, unknowing, into my ear. I told him, evenly, that I was thinking more clearly than I had in a decade, and that if he wanted to sit down like adults, he could come to me. I named a place and a time. I told him to come to the garage. The garage was my grandmother's, on the Barrington land, a detached 2-bay cinder block building she and my grandfather had put up in 1961 to house a Studebaker and a lifetime of tools. And it is the coldest structure I have ever stood in, because cinder block in New Hampshire holds the winter like a grudge well into June. There was no reason to meet there except that it was on the land, and I wanted him standing on the land while we talked. And I wanted, I will admit, the specific dignity of my grandmother's building over his leased Audi. I got there 40 minutes early. I swept the floor, which did not need it. I set 2 folding chairs from my own kitchen in the middle of the concrete, and I put the manila folder on an overturned milk crate between them. And I waited, in my coat, watching my breath, listening to a phoebe nest in the eave the way its grandmother's grandmother probably had. Diane did not come. Zane came alone, and he came, by my watch, exactly 1 hour after our phone call, which is why, when I tell this, I always say it was 1 hour later, because it was. He walked in already talking. That is the thing about Zane, the thing his father did too, the reason I should have seen it coming years before I did. He leads with volume, because volume has always worked for him, because a loud, reasonable man in a nice coat is believed by default, and he has spent 31 years being believed. He told me, striding across my grandmother's concrete in shoes that had never touched dirt, that he'd talked to a lawyer, that I couldn't just do this, that there were protections, that Diane was devastated, that I was clearly not myself, that we needed to get me evaluated, that he was saying all this because he loved me. He was building the incapacity case out loud, in real time, and he did not even know he was doing it. And I let him get all the way to the end of it, because I have learned that a frightened animal does its most revealing thrashing right before it exhausts itself. When he finally stopped, breathing hard in the cold, I told him to sit down. And I told him, in the flat, forensic voice I use to tell a family the mass is on the spleen and the spleen is not the only place, exactly what I knew. I told him the notary was Grady's brother-in-law. I watched that land. I told him the will was dated the 2nd week of April, while I had a central line in my neck, and that I could name the 2 nurses who'd been in my room during those days, and neither was his wife. I told him I had a copy, and I opened the manila folder and turned it toward him on the milk crate, and I watched my son read his wife's forgery of his mother's name in his grandmother's cold garage. I told him I was not pressing charges, and I watched relief cross his face before he could stop it. And then I told him why, which was that he was not worth 2 years of my life, and I watched that land too. Then I told him the part that actually mattered, the part that made the whole elaborate forgery a document about a folding table. I told him about the trust. I told him it was revocable, that I had been its sole trustee for 11 years, that the will he'd forged governed almost nothing I owned, and that I had, 9 days ago, quietly and legally, filed the paperwork that moved everything, the principal, the land under his feet, the deed that had been under the birdseed the whole time he thought he was clever, out of his reach forever. I had filed first. I had already taken the assets, which had always been mine, and made them permanently, boringly, unglamorously, not his. I want to describe what he did, because the genre expects him to go white and beg. And Zane did not do that, because Zane is a coward, and cowards, under a mask of power, don't collapse into honesty. They scrabble for a new mask. First he laughed, one syllable, and said I was bluffing, that I didn't have that kind of money, that this was a stunt. Then, when I said the figure, a little over $2 million, and the acreage, 17, and the name of the Portsmouth firm, and he heard in the specificity that it was real, he shifted without a seam into wounded. How could I do this to my own son, after everything he'd done for me? He actually said that, after everything he'd done for me, standing in the garage where I'd raised the down payment for his cleats out of a lard jar. And I did not laugh, though I wanted to, because contempt is a warmth, and I had decided not to give him even that. When wounded didn't move me, he tried menace, said his lawyer would look into whether I was competent to make these changes. And I told him, gently, that Vanessa had thought of that every document was witnessed and notarized, and that I'd sat for a voluntary cognitive evaluation with my own physician the same week, precisely so that his strip mall lawyer would have nothing to look into, and that the evaluation, unlike the one he'd been quietly building for me out loud for 6 months, was signed by a doctor who was nobody's brother-in-law. And then Zane did the thing that told me I had raised, at least in part, a smaller man than I'd hoped, and that it was, at last, not my job to fix him. He got quiet, and he looked at the folder, and he said, in a voice that had finally run out of masks, "So that's it? You're just going to leave me with nothing?" I thought about the question for a moment, honestly, in the cold, because it deserved a true answer and not a clever one. I told him I wasn't leaving him with nothing. I was leaving him with exactly what he'd had before he married a woman who taught him to look at his mother and see a lot to be developed, which was a mother who would have given him everything she owned if he'd only stayed a person she could give it to. I told him he still had that mother. I was standing right there. I just wasn't going to be appraised anymore, and I wasn't going to be managed, and I wasn't ever again going to answer a Sunday phone call about my cholesterol from a woman taking inventory of the day I'd die. I stood up and folded my 2 kitchen chairs and told him he could see himself off the land, which after that afternoon he had no claim to. And I picked up the folder and walked out of my grandmother's garage into the actual sunlight, and I left him standing in the cold his grandmother's cinder block had been saving up all winter to give him. He did not follow me. Diane sent one email, long, in the relationship management voice, full of the words family and healing and boundaries, which is a word people love once you've grown one. I did not answer it. Vanessa filed a short letter with the county attorney's office, documenting the forgery, not to prosecute, but to sit on record in case they ever tried anything again, which she assured me they would not, because the entire scheme had depended on my not knowing. And I knew. And there is nothing a coward fears like a witness who is unafraid. I heard through a cousin that they'd leased a bigger house and then given it up, and that Grady the advisor was no longer at the church. And I found that I could receive all of it, the way you receive weather in another county, as a thing that was happening, factually, somewhere I did not live. I want to end where I started, on my knees, because that is the only ending that is true. Duckett the Beagle died in October, 19 and a half years old, in the widower's kitchen, with my hand on his ribs and the old man's hand on his ears. And I drove home afterward and did the thing I do, which is refill the bird feeder. I lifted the ball jar off the windowsill, the one that had held my grandmother's lard and my change and my receipts, and for 11 years, the deed to 17 acres beneath a layer of sunflower seed. And I scooped the seed into the feeder on the back rail, and the jar was just a jar now, emptied of its secret, holding nothing but seed and a little dust and the smell of every winter I'd survived to see. A pair of chickadees came down before I'd even shut the door, the way they do, absurdly brave for their size. And I stood at the sink in the last of the light and watched them. 51 years old, still $31 ahead of nothing most weeks by choice. The wealthiest woman on my street and the only one who'd never let it show. And I did not feel triumphant, because triumph was never what I was after. I felt like myself. I felt, for the first time in a very long time, entirely unpriced. I put the empty jar back on the windowsill where it belonged, where it had always belonged, and I filled the kettle, and that was the whole of it. And it was enough.